The Chicago White Sox have officially picked up their $20 million option on Luis Robert. So now let's talk trades.
You are Locked On Mets, your daily New York Mets podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello to all you amazing Mets fans. You're watching Locked On Mets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I'm your host, Ryan Finkelstein, covering the New York Mets on this show since the 2019 season. This is the #1 daily podcast on the New York Mets. If you want to find any of my written work, you can do so over at justbaseball.com, where I work as the editor-in-chief and where I work with today's guest, Elijah Evans. He has been covering the White Sox for a few years now. He does work on the Future Sox Pod, right?
Yes, sir.
Future Sox Pod. And so we're going to get Elijah's take on the Luis Robert situation because it seems like once again, the Mets are in a position where if they want to improve center field and get a stopgap as they wait for Carson Benge, all roads kind of lead to Luis Robert or some bad options. But how good of an option is Luis Robert? So that's what we're going to be going through on the show today. Where I want to start things off, Elijah, is, from afar, it feels like Chris Getz has really botched the asset that is or was Luis Robert. 2023, he was amazing. 2024, we started to get some rumblings of, maybe they're going to trade him because he was having a bad year and that contract was coming closer to expiring, and the White Sox were obviously nowhere close to contention. They don't trade him then. They have a chance to trade him in 2025. Again, they don't trade him. So I just want to know, from your perspective, what has these last 2 years been like when it comes to managing the asset? I think if you go back in time, whatever they were offered in 2024 is probably better than what they're going to get now. But how have you sort of viewed the way they've managed that asset?
Yeah, it's a really hard one to think about and to reflect on as a White Sox fan, because I think that last offseason, you look at the opportunity where the team was coming off of the worst season ever, and you had two assets in Garrett Crochet and in Luis Robert, who you knew were your assets. That's all you had left to really sell from that previous kind of batch of your core, right? And you had a season where Crochet was coming off of this incredible season, and Robert was coming off of what was really disappointing, because in 2023, you saw a guy that flashed MVP type talent at times in the season, right? That was a 129 WRC plus, almost a 5 WAR season in 2023. His first full season of actually playing 100 plus games his entire career. So you saw everything that Luis Robert was supposed to be in 2023. And, in hindsight, you can say, okay, they should have traded him after 2023, but he was coming off of an incredible season where he looked like the future cornerstone of this team at 25 years old. So you hold him going into 24 with the hope that you can cash in at some point. And 2024 just kept getting worse and worse. So anytime you would have sold him during 24, either at the deadline or even after 24, you were already selling lower than the previous season. So you cash in on Crochet when you're selling high. You go into this past season saying, okay, time for Robert to rebuild value. And in little spurts he did, but then he never really did. So at the deadline this year, it was like you were going to either go with an underwhelming offer, or you're just going to hold him hoping he has a big second half, which he actually was starting to have, and then he gets hurt again, which has been the story of his career. So while it is a frustrating situation, and I do think there would have been better ways to handle it, and ultimately you should have just traded him after that big season in 23. At the same time, the team didn't expect to regress to the worst team ever in 24, and you don't want to sell low on a guy who was one of your few remaining key assets you still had on this roster.
To me now, though, it just feels like they're a little stuck because Luis Robert, his best month came in July, leading up to the deadline, which sort of feels like a guy that maybe sees the light at the end of the tunnel of, okay, this is time to turn it on and get traded to a contender. And then it doesn't happen. Obviously, I don't think that he got hurt because he didn't get traded, but I'm just curious, do you have hope that if you actually run this thing out again and you say, all right, we're just going to have Luis Roberts, our starting center fielder, and we're going to hope that the trade deadline, he's an asset. Do you think that there's a world that he could actually perform in Chicago, or is this a guy that needs that change of scenery?
So my hope and my thought there is that like this is a much improving lineup. Even the last 2 months of the season, this lineup was entirely different from the start of 2025 and especially 2024, right? You look at a lineup where you have a full first professional season of a Colson Montgomery, of a Kyle Teal, of an Edgar Caro, right? Like there's at least some young, talented pieces around him compared to that 24 squad and even the beginning of 25, where there was nothing surrounding him and protecting him, right? So I do think from a team perspective, there's some reason to believe that he can turn things around a little. With that said, do I have confidence in him having 4 healthy months of elite production? Not at all. I think it's somewhere in between, right? If you can get a quality first half out of him, if he can play, 75% of games in the first half and put up a 115 WRC plus in that span, have a pop an 800 OPS maybe, right? Then you can trade him for something because every team could use an elite defensive center fielder at the deadline, right? Like that's going to be a position where a team will need that, right? Will they need it from a guy who's injured 3 times in the first half of the season? No. If he can stay healthy, yeah. I do still think there's a real world it happens this offseason, though. I think you can convince a team when you look at this outfield market, if once Bellinger's off the board, once Tucker's off the board, right? I'm sure you've been talking about this on your show, the past few weeks, this free agency market. You're starting to look at what could be the options, right? After those top 2 outfielders, I don't think it's crazy to say there's some teams that would rather take a chance on Luis Robert for 1 year at $20 million than pay Trent Grisham $60 million or pay Harrison Bader $50 million, right? Like, I think there's going to be some teams that would entertain that. I'm not saying it's going to happen, but I do think there's still a world that he gets flipped this offseason because there's teams that look at the market, they miss on Tucker, they miss on Bellinger, they look around the rest of the market and they say, hey, we'd rather just take an upside swing on a 1 year deal than pay Grisham or Bader for multiple years.
So my only thing with this is that I think I agree that they're going to get calls, but what I don't necessarily believe is that they're going to get better calls than they got at the deadline, where the value proposition was then stretch run Luis Robert playing well in July. He was making whatever 15 million, something along those lines. You're prorating it for 2 months and you had the buyout. I think other teams looked at him at the deadline as, all right, a 2-month rental. If he's amazing, sure, we'll pick up 20 million, but more likely than not, it's a 1-year rental and then Luis Robert will hit the market. Now it's $20 million that you are picking up for this season. So I almost wonder if that hurdle of entry for something like that, I feel like the packages are not going to be better now than they were at the deadline. I feel like they're going to be the same at best, if not slightly worse. So is Getz going to pull the trigger on a trade now that he wouldn't make 2 months ago?
Right. And that's why it probably ends up being the deadline again. Right. And that's it. And then you're in the same exact situation as last year because it's another $20 million option in 2027 with another $2 million buyout. Right. So this honestly could be run back the exact same situation for next year. And then you're just throwing money into the wind at that point because the situation with the White Sox, though, and you have to consider this from, I know this is very foreign to all of you Mets fans, but like the White Sox are going to run a payroll under $100 million this year. That's been pretty clearly indicated by everyone in the organization. Right now, the only 2 contracts that are not arbitration or pre-arb are Andrew Benintendi at $17 million and Luis Robert at $20 million. So the projected payroll is under $60 million right now. So as much as this team is still going to stay under $100 million probably, which is, gross, but it's just the reality of the White Sox right now, they do have the ability to pay this contract. Like no matter what they do in the offseason, this contract is you're going to pay somebody, you got to pay somebody. So I think they're okay with that. Like, dang it, we're stuck with Robert, but we can afford to pay it because we're not adding a ton of contracts to the payroll. So you'd almost rather just say, okay, whatever, we'll just pay the contract, we'll deal with it. If he performs out of the gate, great, we flip him. Even if maybe I could see like a Luis Ariz type of situation where he gets flipped in like May and it's just like a hot month or two and you say, all right, let's get him out of here for a team that wants to acquire him. Yeah, it's expensive, but at least you're getting even more than just the last 2 months of the season if he was traded at the deadline, right? Maybe it's hey, we want to have him for 4 months in our lineup. If we can keep him healthy, he's a big piece of a contending team, right? So I think there's multiple options. I think if a team comes in and matches even what they were getting offered at the deadline, you could see a move happen this offseason. But if you can't even match the deadline offers, then yeah, we're running it back where you're going to wait to see how this season goes. You hope and pray he stays healthy. If he stays healthy, you flip him at the deadline. If not, we might be in this exact same situation in a year from now.
And it'd be crazy if they picked it up again, but it's kind of like Chris Getz is, at a point with this asset where he's determined to get something, whatever that value line in the sand he's put out there, he wants to get it. And it's not the worst gamble to make because Luis Robert could turn it on, but it's also, to me, it's just seeming like it feels like a losing proposition. What I want to do in the next segment is I want to talk about what we heard about a Mets Robert trade at the deadline, what I think could have been on the table, what the White Sox wanted, and if they can get what they want now because of the situation the Mets are in. So we're going to go through all of that in just a minute. This episode is brought to you by Prize Picks. The daily fantasy app where making the right call can actually pay off. You and I make decisions every day, but on Prize Picks, being right means cashing in. With football back, Prize Picks is the simplest and fastest way to get in on the action. Just pick more or less on 2 to 6 player projections, and you could turn your takes into real prizes all in less than 60 seconds. It's quick, it's easy, and honestly, it's my favorite way to follow along with not just football, but you also got basketball. And the cool thing is you could combine both sports into the same lineup. So you can look at Thursday Night Football, look at the NBA slate, pick player projections for both different games, and even if one of your picks mix, Prize Picks invented Flex Play, so you can still double your money. Download the Prize Picks app today and use the code LOCKEDONMLB to get $50 in lineups after your first $5 lineup. That's code LOCKEDONMLB for $50 in lineups after your first $5 play. Prize Picks, it's good to be right. If you're watching on YouTube, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button. Help us get to our next goal of 15,000 subscribers. I'd love to get there by the end of this year. We're within 200. Really do appreciate all of you who continue to subscribe. Now, when we looked at Luis Robert getting traded to the Mets at the deadline, the one report that we got that felt pretty concrete was that the White Sox, actually there was a few names that were floated. One was Jonah Tong, which was never going to happen, that the Mets were going to trade one of their top pitching prospects, arguably the most dominant pitcher in the minor leagues this past year, for Luis Robert. Just wasn't going to happen. But the other one was Mark Vientos. And the Mets are in an interesting spot with Vientos because you can make a case that they're better off moving on from him. He certainly might be better off with a change of scenery, just because when you have a positionless guy on your roster, there's so much pressure on that bat. We saw this past season. If he doesn't hit, you're kind of stuck when he has no options. But before we get into the Vientos side of it, I think at the deadline, the Mets might have been able to, or might have offered, the Blade Tidwell, Drew Gilbert package that went to the Giants for Tyler Rogers. In retrospect, do you think that that is something the White Sox should have taken if it was on the table?
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't hate it. It's just such a tricky situation, man, because I think you can look at that deal and say, okay, you got two pieces that you feel okay about. Do I think either of those players are a impact big league player at any point in their career? Not really. So that's where it's like, what's that trade-off? Like Gilbert, sure. Like I think Gilbert could plug in the White Sox outfield tomorrow and be a player there. But I think the White Sox still are hoping to get one asset. I don't think it's about getting two guys you think can be decent. I think when it comes to Robert, given what we've seen from the upside of him and what he can be, and the fact that you've held him that long, I believe that they're holding out for one piece that they really think can be a part of the next future wave of the White Sox, honestly. Yeah, that's what it comes down to. And if they thought Gilbert was that, they would have pulled the trigger on that trade, honestly, if that was on the table, right? And I probably would have pulled the trigger on that if I believed that in either of those guys either, but I don't necessarily. And I think that the White Sox are going to hold for a piece that they believe can be part of the future. Is Mark Vientos that piece? Like, maybe. I think there's a world he could be. Do I see a chance for that being a Gilbert or a Tidwell? Not really. So maybe that is the difference, right? Maybe the difference is just getting a singular asset in this type of trade that you think can progress and develop or refine something to become a legitimate piece of the White Sox future core. Because I don't know if it was either of those guys. And in any trade they're looking for, like we talked about, given how long they've been holding on to Robert, it almost has to be at least one asset that you really think can be a piece.
So that brings us to the Mark Vientos side of it, where it made sense that that was their ask, because Mark Vientos, if you're talking about after the 2024 season, we had him ranked at Just Baseball as like the number 9 third baseman in the game because of how good he was in 2024. He hit 27 bombs in 111 games, hit 5 more in the postseason. So it was like 32 bombs in, I want to say, 125 games. That was a guy that had a really, really bright future that had a bad year. Now, he's been up and down throughout his big league career. but I can see why the White Sox even now would say, you know what? Either Miguel Vargas or Mark Vientos, one of those guys should be able to hit, right? So I think it makes sense that they would definitely pull the trigger on a Mark Vientos trade. For the Mets side of it, though, they didn't do it before because 4 years still, at the deadline was 4.5 years, but 4 years of team control on Mark Vientos is, in theory, in a vacuum, significantly more valuable than Luis Robert off of 2 down seasons making $20 million. So here's where I think you can actually find some middle ground. If the Mets have been trying this offseason to shop Jeff McNeil because they want to clear Jeff McNeil's contract, and they're either finding that they have to eat too much money or there's no interest, you plug Jeff McNeil in this deal. And what that does for you is it takes Luis Robert in that $20 million. Now you're interchanging $15.75 million that Jeff McNeil is going to make. They have identical buyouts on 2027 options, $2 million for each of them. So both of these teams can wipe their hands clean of the bad money, so to speak, in 2027 if it doesn't work out for them. And then you get Mark Vientos coming back to the White Sox. I'll talk about it from a Mets perspective after I get your take. What would you think about swallowing McNeil to get Vientos in this deal, especially also acknowledging that Jeff McNeil on a rebuilding team might not be that bad and could be flipped at the deadline. It could work out.
The interesting thing to consider there with the Sox is like you need more bats. Like the White Sox need to add a couple bats this offseason. So the idea of turning one bat into 2 bats, one of which could actually be a future piece of this team, it makes some sense, man. It really does. I think it makes a lot of sense for this roster. And I think that when you look at Vientos, the White Sox have a flexible option where Miguel Vargas is going to play one of the 2 corners. He played both corners last year, but the other corner is completely up for grabs. Yeah, you had a 20 homer season from Lenyn Sosa. Like me and most White Sox fans are not putting much stock into that. And beyond that, even Vargas hasn't necessarily proven his validity as a long-term piece of this team. So with Vientos in the fold there, you could mix and match Vargas and Vientos at first and third. You know, I think it seems like Vientos is probably trending towards being better at first in terms of like what his long-term projection is. You have room to play him there. If you want to still get him reps at third, you can get him reps at third and Vargas can play first and vice versa, right? And then on the McNeil side, the only thing with McNeil that's interesting to consider is like where he would play. I guess center field. I know you kind of were on the McNeil playing center field wave. Like the White Sox at middle infield is the most crowded position on the roster, right? Like there's the Colson Montgomery at short and 3 or 4 young guys that are going to rotate at second base. So the thing with McNeil is like, where does he play? Because as of right now, you've got Benintendi and Mike Tauchman in the corners, and then the Robert spot in center. So maybe it is McNeil playing some center for the White Sox and then mixing and matching in left and right with Tauchman and with Benny. I'm not sure exactly what he would do in terms of like how he fits in the daily lineup. But you're right. I don't think McNeil would be terrible. I think if he has a good first half, you can flip him at the deadline. He can plug a hole. He can provide some good contact at the top of the lineup for a young team that has a lot of young hitters in the lineup you're going to be relying on. And then with Vientos, like it's not that different of a profile. I mean, they're different players, of course, but they're both going to whiff a ton, and they both have a lot of natural pop. Vientos has been a guy who in 24 was barreling everything, and you know even in 25, like the hard hit rate was over 50% in 2025 for Vientos. So that's a guy that looking at his numbers, I'm like, okay, I can get behind a buy low on Vientos, right? And like you said, 4 years of control for the White Sox to turn Robert into any like potential legitimate asset who has had a nearly 30 homer big league season and has 4 more years of control. I'm all for that. If it means eating McNeil, like again, the White Sox are going to have some money on the books. So even if you're getting off of Robert, sure, you take McNeil back, you're still at a $50 million payroll, and you get a chance on Vientos becoming a pretty good piece for 4 years.
Yeah, and I think, to me, it's a no-brainer for the White Sox because, you don't have a spot for Jeff McNeil necessarily, but Jeff McNeil being a guy that's been super utility throughout his career, you'll find a day at second, a day in left, a day in right, throw him in, whatever it is. Like that's fine. The Mets side of it is more complicated because I can make a case that trade makes the Mets worse if Luis Robert is what he's been. And then Jeff McNeil is going to be a 2-win player for you. He's going to fill a lot of holes. Mark Vientos could be your DH. The way that the Mets make this trade, the reason they make this trade is for a more coherent roster after the deal because you have a stopgap center fielder. And if Carson Benge is awesome and Robert is just okay, he's going to mash lefties. You can platoon those guys and ease Benge into the big league. So I think that fit is great. And then you're clearing 2 roster spots to open up, potentially room for Benge, for Jet Williams, for Luis Angel Acuna, Ronnie Mauricio, maybe then by clearing Vientos, you're able to get a DH. Maybe you swing a trade. I've talked about Wilson Contreras. So to me, on paper, it's a no-brainer for the White Sox. Just pure trade value machine. It's not the best deal for the Mets, but if you can make the decision internally that moving on from McNeil and Vientos might be a better thing for your core moving forward, you're taking a flyer on Robert. And I think it's worth it in that sense. And again, you're turning Luis Robert into a $4.25 million addition to your payroll. That's a lot easier to stomach for me.
Right. And I think with the Mets, the one thing I'd be considering, I'm sure you've thought about it too, is like, you have so many young hitters coming up that I think there's a world where if Robert is at least a average starting center fielder for you as these young guys make their way up, like you said, you fill out the roster with an extra spot to promote guys when they're ready. And it just gives you a little more flexibility too. I think the angle of like, okay, if Brett Beatty's your everyday third baseman, which sounds like you're ready for that to be the case, and then you've got, assuming Pete comes back, right, you do have the flexibility to add another first base and or DH type if you want to do that, or you just continue to bolster the rest of that lineup with all these young hitters, with a Jet, with a Benge, when all these guys, with Mauricio, right? You've got options to fill out that lineup. And if Robert ends up being the better version of Robert, then you've got a guy in your 6 hole or your 7 hole that was a top 10 player in the American League 2 years ago. So yeah, he's probably not getting back to that level. But if you get an above average everyday center fielder from Luis Robert, I mean, you're getting elite defense, right? So you're getting the Tyron Taylor elite defense. But if he can get back to even 80% of his offensive ceiling, then you've added a impact player for, not a ton of salary, like you say there, and for clearing up some other roster spots for these young guys that are on the way.
And do you think it's fair to say that regardless of if he's going to hit right-handed pitching,
Yes.
like he's going to hit lefties no matter what, basically?
He always has. He's going to hit lefties, and he's going to play exceptional defense when he's healthy in center field. So if that's your baseline, right, it's not a terrible swing to take for a Mets team that can afford to platoon, because you have enough talent on that roster to platoon some guys. And you know that if the worst case is even if he's your starting center fielder every day, if he's hitting 8 against righties because he's hitting poorly, right, you have an elite defensive center fielder hitting at the bottom of your lineup who then you can bump up to the 5 hole against lefties, and he's going to mash. So,
I think it makes sense. The one hurdle I have is just the idea of trading Mark Vientos when he could just be that DH bat for you. And I think if you could pull off a trade where you keep Vientos, get Luis Robert, all of a sudden you might have to do a single thing to your lineup. So that's what we're going to talk about to close out the show. Is there a prospect-centric package where the Mets keep Vientos but still land Luis Robert? We're going to go through my offer in just a sec. Today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. The NBA season's here, and FanDuel has an offer you don't want to miss. Right now, new customers can bet just $5, and if you win, you're going to get $300 in bonus bets. That's right. You pick a bet, you put down $5. If it hits, you're going to unlock $300 in bonus bets to use across the app. I love using FanDuel because it fits however you like to bet, whether it's player props, building the same game parlay, or even jumping in live as the action unfolds. It makes watching football even more exciting when you got a little bit of something right on the action. Same thing goes with your basketball games. Whether you're a casual fan or you love diving into the stats, FanDuel is going to make the game day experience so much better. It's quick, it's easy, it's the best way to add a little more energy to your Sundays or whatever day of the week you're watching some sports. So if you're ready to play, download the FanDuel app now by visiting FanDuel.com to get started. That's FanDuel.com to place your first $5 bet. If you're an everydayer that always tunes into the show, make sure you become a Locked On Mets insider. This is our texting service where you get updates from anytime news breaks on the Mets. You can ask me questions anytime. You can take part in our Locked On Mets signed photo giveaways. If you want to be a Locked On Mets insider, find the link in the episode description or go to subtext.com/LockedOnMets. Now, when it comes to a prospect-centric package, if it was as simple as the Mets decided we're win now mode, we want Mark Vientos around, but we're willing to give up another corner bat that's in AAA. Would you be more excited if you can get your hands on Ryan Clifford with still taking Jeff McNeil over Mark Vientos?
Yeah, more. I don't know about more. I think Clifford, from all indications, has trended up this season for sure. It seems like he's rounded out his game a little bit. It was definitely a profile that had some risk to it. Someone who you saw the power, but there wasn't quite the vision of an everyday player. After this season, I think there's a world where you can do that. And the other thing with the White Sox is they can't afford to get some corner bats. Like there's not a lot of corner bats in the system. Weirdly enough, the farm system is very infield heavy. It's very middle infield heavy. There's not a ton of like 100% corner guys. Clifford, like, it doesn't seem like he's going to play the outfield. I don't know if you remember how many games he played in the outfield this year, but it definitely seems like he's trending towards a first base primarily guy, which, the White Sox don't really have a first baseman of the future. And I do think that Clifford is an interesting piece. I don't mind the idea of taking a chance on Clifford because he saw a lot of growth this season. You seem to, he seemed to get better against velocity and just kind of improve as he was at a higher level, facing some higher level pitching. He just looked a little more comfortable in the box this season. So I do think Clifford would be an attractive piece. I'm not sure I'd say more than Vientos, but I do think a Clifford could be a, headlining prospect of a deal that the White Sox could see getting behind.
I think for me, like the trade that I'd be attracted to the most would probably be, I mean, obviously, like I could throw together 3 prospects where it's, if you're not taking the McNeil contract, then we could talk like Nick Morabito is definitely a guy the Mets are going to shop because they have to add him to the 40. Solid, I think probably 4th outfitter in the big leagues, but he does have a lot of speed, stole 49 bases in Double-A this year. He's having a great fall league, so he's showcasing himself well. It's in 340 out there. 12 steals, 13 games, 907 OPS. So I think he's going to be just outside our top 10 as Arms updating our top 15 prospects for the Mets for just baseball right now. So it's not nothing. I think Acuna would be very easy to throw in a trade for the Mets because he has to be now rostered. He's out of options. But for the White Sox, I mean, you have a lot of middle infield guys, but a utility guy you can plug in right now. And then you throw like an arm like RJ Gordon in it. But like, to me, it sounds like what we've been talking about, what we've been leading the conversation to is Getz would be more interested in getting the one bigger piece.
Yeah, and then a secondary maybe, but I think the goal is one piece that you can dream on being a at least strong side platoon big leaguer.
And you know what? Maybe if the Mets were really motivated to get it done and they maybe felt like Nick Morabito was on the verge of where Drew Gilbert was, which I think was sort of 40-man roster excess when you had to protect him. You have Carson Benge coming. You have AJ Ewing, who's a more highly regarded center field prospect. Then all of a sudden, I think you could come to terms here where you get off Jeff McNeil, you give Ryan Clifford up, and if you re-sign Pete Alonso, you don't have a ton of future outlook for Ryan Clifford anyway. But I think for the White Sox, more control, full options, still an exciting piece. You keep Vientos for this season, and then Nick Morabito is a little sweetener who, quite honestly, could impact the White Sox potentially as soon as this season. So that might be the most complete trade that I think makes sense for both sides.
Yeah, I can see it for sure. You mentioned Ewing there. That's another one I was going to bring up because I think that would be a pretty attractive piece for the Sox. I think the idea of a, potentially plus hit, plus run guy who can play center field potentially, which the White Sox, I think that once you trade Robert, like there's nobody lining up to play center field for the White Sox. I think that's the one thing where like it seems weird to be like, oh, we're going to trade our like former center fielder of the future for just another center field prospect. But I do think that's the optimal outcome for the White Sox is to get someone who can play center field as soon as this season, or even maybe if it's next season, sure, you sign a stopgap to play center field for 1 year. But I think that getting a center field prospect who you can actually put as your future center fielder potentially would be the ultimate goal for the White Sox in this trade, which is why Ewing becomes interesting at that point. And maybe it's Morabito. Maybe they see more in Morabito and they see him being a little bit more interesting than some of the other, his general ranking might be. But I do think that you'd have to. I have a feeling in this deal, the White Sox would be targeting either a Clifford or an Ewing as that kind of headline deal potentially. Obviously, there's bigger names than those two, but I don't think any of those bigger names would be at play. There's some pitchers that are kind of in that similar tier to those guys. I think the White Sox would much rather get a legitimate bat, whether it's a corner guy or a center fielder potentially in this type of deal.
Yeah, and see, with AJ Ewing, like I have AJ Ewing already pegged in my mind. If he's going to the Brewers for Freddie Peralta, it just makes the most sense in the world that AJ Ewing would be a Brewers guy. Yeah. But at the same time, I don't know, like I don't know how much the Mets would even want to put Ewing on the table because I even think if you're looking at them as farm system, I think optimal outcome for the next 2 years is Ewing becomes the center fielder, Benge becomes the right fielder, and so does your DH. Like that's if everything breaks right with your prospects, the dream scenario. I think they'd be a lot more willing to trade one of the corner guys or Nick Morabito, which again, he could be your starting center fielder this year. I think defensively he'll be good in center. He's going to bring speed. He just there's so much pressure on him to hit for average because he's got no pop. Granted, we still don't know if AJ Ewing is going to translate the EVs to game power anyway, but not to get into too in the weeds. I do think that these sides make a lot of sense. I think the Jeff McNeil, Luis Robert component is, I think, the key to getting a trade done because it makes that barrier of entry for the Mets so much easier to stomach. I think that McNeil actually.
Come on, Steve Cohen. I'm just kidding.
Well, the thing is, they have their payroll is so high already. I did on yesterday's show. I projected contracts for Pete Alonso and Edwin Diaz. That will push them if they sign those two guys to like $300 million before they do anything else. And while Steve Cohen can have a $400 million payroll if he wants to, they've operated at 350 the last two or 3 years. So I think that's sort of his comfort zone. And so if you add on 20 million of Robert without getting rid of Jeff McNeil's contract, plus you added Pete, plus you added Diaz, now that's like your biggest outside addition of the offseason. And I think that's too much for the Mets. So again, that's where I think that I think that's the foundation of a deal. And I think that these two sides very well could come together on a trade. So we'll see. If a trade happens, I'll have Elijah back on and we'll discuss it. What I want to do real quick before we close out the show, because it is a busy week for the MLB offseason, a lot of things happen. I want to keep you Mets fans updated on all of the things that went down when it comes to contract options on Tuesday here. So you had Brooks Raley picked up, or the Mets picked up Brooks Raley's club option. No surprises there. $4.75 million, a very easy pickup for the Mets. They did not pick up Drew Smith's option, which to me indicates one of two things. Either the rehab didn't go well off Tommy John, because basically they just did him a favor. They gave him $1 million to rehab with them in 2025 with the club option at $2 million, or they just felt that they didn't want to guarantee him a spot in their bullpen. So that was a little bit of a surprise, but not entirely. Frankie Montas obviously picked up his player option. That became official. The Mets made a minor trade that you don't really have to worry about. Joey Gerber came over from the Rays. He was DFA'd, 40-man casualty for them. Mets pick up a reliever that they probably value his stuff, but not even a guy that I would ensure is on the 40-man roster by the time we get to spring training. And then they also re-signed Brandon Waddell to a split contract. People freaked out at first because it was reported as an MLB deal, but it's a split contract. Essentially, that means Brandon Waddell can repeat the role that he served very well for the Mets this past year as that, filler guy that can come up and down, give you a spot start, give you bulk relief. So minor transactions, but now you know everything that happened on Tuesday. And the one thing that I wanted to talk with Elijah about before we close, that was the big surprise. We were texting about it. Shane Bieber, he picked up a $16 million player option when he had a $4 million buyout on a player option. He was going to get $4 million to leave and then go into the market. And if the Blue Jays actually they couldn't give him a kill, he got traded, but he was going to get 1 year, $20 million at least. I predicted the Mets to sign Shane Bieber for 2 years, $45 million. We got to update that article. Stunned? I'm shocked.
Yeah, this was a casualty of the dang, we lost the World Series in Game 7. And all respect to Bieber. Like, I respect the heck out of him for this, honestly, because this was genuinely the result of like, crap, I lost us the World Series. I want to win this World Series with this team because he was the losing pitcher in Game 7 of the World Series, and that does not feel good for anybody ever. And ultimately, I think this was genuinely him just saying, I am putting the fact that I'm on a good team that just barely lost the World Series ahead of the money, and I want to run this back for one more year, and I want to redeem ourselves next season, honestly, it's crazy to see, but every once in a while you get these things in free agency where it is truly an emotional decision and not a financial one, and that's what this felt like from Bieber. I caution people not to react to this and think it affects the market, because I really don't think it does. No. I don't think this is an indication that Bieber thought he was getting less than 16 on the market, because he definitely was getting more than 16 on the market. This is truly just a damn, that was a heartbreaking loss. I need to run this back for my heart and soul for one more season. I really think that's what this situation was. And Bieber's a guy, I mean, Bieber went to my alma mater, UC Santa Barbara, and like all indications are he's the type of person who like just genuinely cares about winning more than anything. And like, this was like the exact sign of that. So really big surprise. I mean, even like his contract market value on Spot Tracks is 24.5 million of his market value AAV. Like he was getting more than 16 and 12 million actually, because you factor in the buyout, right? Like he was getting way more than that on the open market. I think he wants that World Series, man. Toronto wants it. And it honestly makes me think more and more that Bo Bichette's going to stay with Toronto. That's actually the biggest takeaway that I had from that decision.
You know, the crazy part again, like it's not just it's the fact that he had a $4 million. Like
Yeah.
it is his agent. I don't know how his agent feels, but hey, it's his decision. It's wild because the other part I think was playing out for Shane Bieber. That's crazy. And again, it can point back to him wanting to stay in Toronto is he was the one guy. There's a lot of guys in this same bucket. You have Zach Allen, you have Michael King. You have a lot of these guys who are coming off of incomplete seasons that are potentially lining up for more shorter term, higher AAV deals. A lot of those guys are going to get qualifying offers, and Shane Bieber getting traded was not going to have a qualifying offer attached. So I could have even seen a world where Shane Bieber might have gotten a 5-year deal. I think it put like,
I mean, yeah, maybe. I get what you're saying.
I'm just saying when you look at the whole market, which I've been, spending like my last 3 weeks just doing nothing but that, he becomes so much more attractive because he was the one guy that didn't have the qualifying offer attached, or you knew was not going to have the qualifying offer attached that had the upside where, yeah, I think it was probably high AAV 2 or 3 year deal, but it could have been, there could have been a team that just said, you know what, screw it. We believe Shane Bieber's back. We're going to lock him in for, 5 years and, $20 million per and give him an out there after this. Like he could have gotten a much bigger bag, but like you said, shout out to him for valuing winning and a huge win for this
win for Toronto. Huge win for Toronto. You look at this roster and you see Kevin Gausman and a fully ramped up Trey Savage, and you're like, okay, you feel really good about that top two, but Gausman's not getting any younger. Trey Savage obviously could have some second year bumps. He's only pitched in 11 big league games, and I know it was incredible, but still. And then you look at the market and you're like, okay, the Blue Jays got to add a pitcher. Now you get a pitcher essentially for $12 million because you didn't have to pay the buyout. You're getting a $12 million Shane Bieber, who, for all we know, could be a 2-starter next year. Like there's a world where Bieber is the better version of, maybe it's not the Cy Young Bieber from 6 years ago, but he could at least be a legitimate 2-starter and a really, really solid 3-headed monster with those other two in Toronto. And now you still have a little bit of money to play with, because if you were factoring in 20, 25 million to go get a stud pitcher, now you've got some extra money to play with and go get another one. Why not? Why can't the Blue Jays go get another starter? Obviously, Max Scherzer, like maybe he's coming back for another year. It sucks he couldn't just retire on top, but you have the flexibility now for Toronto. Maybe that extra money goes towards keeping Bichette or goes after a bigger bat, whether it's Tucker or Bellinger, maybe, right? Like you've got options here for Toronto after, having basically $12 million allocated to a guy that could easily be a very good starting pitcher.
They are the most interesting team, I think, right now this offseason by far.
Because go for it, man, because they should go for it. They almost beat the Dodgers. They probably should have beat the Dodgers in the World Series. And now you've got, Bichette's a free agent, sure, but you've got a lot of that core that's locked. They locked up Vladdy. They locked up Alejandro Kirk. They've got a variety of those same players. Obviously, you've got 6 years of Trey Savage coming up. Like, you're in a spot to make to strike really here. And if you're not going for Tucker, which you projected Tucker, which I think is possible for sure, but if you're not going Tucker, you can at the least keep Bichette and add more to that.
Yeah, keep Bichette, sign a top starter, and you're good to go. So check out Locked On Blue Jays. I'm sure they are going to be going nuts on the Shane Bieber situation on today's show. So everybody check that out as your second listen if you're curious about it. Thank you, Elijah, for joining me on the show today. Appreciate all of you for tuning in. Make sure you follow, rate, and review wherever you get your podcast. Subscribe if you're watching on YouTube. If you want to be Locked On Mets Insider, you can find the link in the episode description or go to subtext.com/LockedOnMets.